Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk It Out podcast. I'm Al Glyph aka Trey Busy. It's Tuesday, October 8th, 2019. It's a beautiful day outside. But before I go on about the day, I just want to say I have a very special guest here with me today for the interview. This guy, I've read his book several times. I've made suggestions to other people to read it. I just want to welcome to the podcast published author Mark Wolynn and to talk about his book, It Didn't Start With You, and How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle.
Oh, thanks for having me, Alec. I'm looking forward to it.
So, Mark, we're going to go ahead and just jump right into there. Mark's book, It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. First of all, this book was incredible to me. You know, when I first read it, it just so many things clicked in my life for that, you know, the reason I'm the man I am today, the reason my father is the man he is today, my mom's the woman she is, my siblings are who they are. Just so many things clicked when I read this book. It was like an epiphany to a realization, really, of just why things are the way they are, right? So,
thank you for saying that. I mean, it's why I wrote it. We're all walking around with a mystery that we can't explain. We have these fears, these anxieties that strike suddenly. We hit a certain age, Alec, and all of a sudden it's the same age that something happened in our family, but we haven't made the connection, or we experience a certain event, and all of a sudden that tips us into a depression, and we never get to the bottom of it. What I found is we have these symptoms, but they may not be ours, or they didn't start with us. That's the name, like you said, the name of the book, It Didn't Start With You. These symptoms could be the residues of trauma in our family history, and we've merely biologically inherited the stress response of our parents and our grandparents. So that's why I wrote it. I mean, a lot of people were in the dark, not knowing why I am, just like you said, why I am the way I am.
I mean, when I'm telling you, it was like a brain blast of just information. Just reading it, it's like, oh man, especially like it was a portion of the book where it was discussing how someone, their great grandmother was in the Holocaust. It's just those feelings that just get passed down to people, and it's like, I want to ask you, Mark, directly, how can trauma be passed on from a parent to a child?
So, for this, we have to look at what physically happens when there's a trauma. When a trauma happens, we get changed, Alec. It literally causes a chemical change in our DNA. And this changes how our genes function, sometimes for generations. So technically, an event happens, a trauma happens, something traumatic happens, and a chemical tag will attach to our DNA. And it tells the cells to use or ignore certain genes, and then the way the genes are affected can change how we act or feel. For example, we can become reactive to situations that are similar to a trauma that may have taken place in a generation before, so we can deal with it better. So it's kind of crazy. I'll explain it this way. Let's say our grandparents came from a war-torn country. There's bullets flying, there's bombs going off, there's people being lined up, there's people that are losing their freedom. They would pass forward a skill set of sharper reflexes and quicker reaction times, to help us survive the trauma they experienced. But the problem is, we could also inherit a stress response with the dials set to 10, and here we are prepared for a catastrophe that never arrives. We're preparing for our grandparents' catastrophe, their war, and we're walking around with their shutdown, their anxiety, their depression, their obsessive thoughts, and never making the link that the real feelings originated with them. We walk around thinking this is just who I am. It's just the way I'm wired. I'm just wired this way.
So yeah, I mean, that's again when it was like a light came on. When I was reading your book, it was like, man, is that why I think that way? Is that why I feel that way about certain things? Um, Scientific. I mean, the fact that it's passed on from cells to cells, and it comes to you like that's it's so it's really truly just man, I was stuck, and I'm at a loss for words right now just thinking about it still. So how did you get started in this work, Mark?
I, like most of us, I also carried trauma. I had no idea what it was. For me, it just looked like depression or anxiety. Um, but I began to lose the vision in one of my eyes. And I went to the doctors, and they all they could tell me is I had this chronic form of retinopathy, and there was nothing medicine could do. They said the best we can say is it's stress related. This is about 28 years ago. And so I get diagnosed with this chronic form of retinopathy. The doctors can't cure it. They can't do anything. But they did tell me the way it's progressing, you're likely going to lose the vision in your other eye too. And I was desperate. I mean, terrified. I find out that I'm going to lose my eyesight, and there's nothing they can do for me. So I went on a search for healing, really a search that led me halfway around the world, literally as far as Indonesia, where I learned from several wise teachers who taught me some fundamental principles, one of which was the importance of healing my relationship with my parents. But before I could do that, I had to heal what stood in the way, which is all this inherited family trauma, which I didn't know at the time, but it's expressing in anxiety and fear of relationships. And, if you look back in my family, each of my grandparents had been orphaned in some way. Three of them lost their mothers when they were babies. And then the fourth one, she lost her dad when she was one. So ultimately, she loses her mother too, because her mother's grieving. And this anxiety, this feeling of being left, this feeling of being rejected, this was the real cause of my vision loss. All they told me was stress. So I had this image that, well, there's some stress going on in my body. I just have no idea what that stress was. But as I looked deeper, I had inherited this feeling of being broken from a mother's love. I mean, that was what was passed down in my family. I remember, Alec, even as a small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, and I'd feel panic every time my mom would leave the house, and I'd run into her rooms, and I'd open up her drawers, and I'd cry into her scarves and nightgowns, thinking that I'd never see her again, and that all I would have left would be her smell, which was really the only thing left my grandparents had, because they're babies when their moms died, and the only thing that they do have left is the smell in her clothes or the smell in the blanket. 40 years later, I remember telling my mom, I shared this with my mom, and she said, honey, I did the exact same thing when my mother left the house. And then my sister reading the book said, honey, I did the same thing when mom would leave the house. And I realized the family pattern in my house was to be terrified when a mother would even leave the room. And after healing the broken attachment, the broken bond that I had with my mom, which was both early and generational, my vision came back, my sight came back. I didn't think, I'd given up ever thinking it would. It was just sort of one of these things that just happened. And afterwards I felt, hey, there's something about this idea of looking back into the generations and also to heal our relationship with our parents. And then I felt compelled to share these principles, the principles I'd learned from these teachers. And ultimately, I developed a method for healing the effects of inherited family trauma.
Thank you for sharing that, Mark. It's just one of the things that you really said that resonates. Some people don't understand how much stress can have on effect on you physically. It's not just making you anxious, but stress can begin deteriorate you physically. Like I've I've been stressed out and just start you get sick, or I start feeling pains in certain areas I haven't felt it before. Stress is very powerful. It's a very powerful tool against yourself. So,
Oh,
uh,
absolutely. There's one of the researchers that I talk about in my book, Rachel Yehuda. Something that she says it's always stuck with me. That she says that if one of our parents had post-traumatic stress disorder, just one, that you and I are 3 times more likely to have symptoms of PTSD. And as a result, we're likely to have stress, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, symptoms, and yes, stress is a killer. And when our parents had stress, and that stress response can pass down physically, biologically. In other words, we can inherit the stress response and then the way our genes express because of the stress they experience. And, this pattern in humans can be observed for 2 generations, but now they are looking at studies with mice and that they can show that the stress can pass down 3 generations. And the reason we look at mice is mice and humans share 92, 93% of a similar genetic makeup, which means for every gene in a human, there's a counterpart in mice, with over 80% of them being identical, more or less every gene. Not, you can't say every, but the significant thing is we can get a generation of mice in 12 to 20 weeks, where it takes 12 to 20 years to get a generation in humans. And furthermore, what they do in the lab, they can cause adversity to the mice and then look at the biological effects. There's several studies that I talk about in the book, but one that really strikes me is one they did at Emory Medical School in Atlanta, where they took male mice and made them afraid of this, stressed them out by making them afraid of this cherry blossom-like scent. Every time they smelled the scent, they'd shock them. And then they looked at that first generation, and they could find changes right there in the brain with the mice that were shocked, and in the blood and the sperm. But in the brain, they saw enlarged areas where there were a greater amount of smell receptors, so the mice could detect the scent, the cherry blossom scent, at a lesser concentration, right in that first generation. We're not even talking about the second and third generation. Right there in that first generation, their brains changed. Their brains had epigenetically adapted to protect them by creating more smell receptors. And so they had this idea, well, we can see these changes in the sperm and in the blood. What if we take this sperm and we impregnate female mice that weren't shocked? And that's what they did. And then they looked at the pups and grandpups in the second and third generation. And the crazy thing, Alec, just by smelling the smell, not even by being shocked, these mice became jumpy and jittery. They had inherited the stress response without directly experiencing the trauma. And that's us. We're affected by what happened to our dad, by what happened to our mom, by what happened in their marriage, by what happened if there was a crime, by what happened if there was a trauma, what happened if someone died. These things create physical changes, chemical changes, and that's what's passed forward. One of the most replicated studies in all of epigenetics is kind of like what happened in my family, what I was telling you about. What they do is they cause adversity to baby mice by separating them from their mothers. And I talk about this also in the book. And in fact, pretty much I can quote this chapter verbatim because I remember it. And not this chapter, this paragraph, these 4 sentences. But, they talk about in this one study, the researchers prevented the females from nurturing their pups for only up to 3 hours a day for the first 2 weeks of life. And then later in life, their kids, their offspring exhibited behaviors similar to what we call depression in humans. And then the symptoms seemed to worsen as the mice aged. And then in this one particular study, what was so interesting, Some of the males didn't express the behaviors themselves, the male mice, but appeared to epigenetically transmit the behavioral changes to their female children, their female offspring. That's like fathers going off to war or jail and coming back numb from the trauma, and daughters carrying their father's fight or flight or freeze response. Dad's shaking, his terror, his shutdown. But it's not just fathers and daughters. What we learn about trauma is, it's an equal opportunity employer, male children and female children, mothers and fathers, doesn't matter. Boy children, girl children, equally impacted from a mother or father's trauma. Just about every week I put a new study on my Facebook page. And, there's a recent study I just put in Journal of American Medicine Psychiatry, which this is not in the book, it's brand new, which followed mothers who suffered trauma as children. And they found that their daughters were likely to struggle with depression and bipolar disorder. And then there's a recent Tufts University study that looked at men who suffered trauma as children and found that they were able to pass their anxiety on to their children through their sperm. They looked at their ACE scores, their adverse childhood experience scores. And this was the first study to show that the human sperm mirrored the same changes that was found in the mice sperm. Technically there's this mechanism called non-coding RNA. I can talk more about it if we want, but it's the genetic material, one of the genetic materials that regulates gene expression. And that's what they observe in the mice that are traumatized as pups. And so they're now finding the same types of changes in humans. This is a new field, Alex. So it's every week there's something new coming out, and it's wonderful and disturbing at the same time. Disturbing in that we learn that our parents' traumas can become our traumas. Wonderful in that they're now also able to reverse the trauma symptoms in mice and give us an idea as to how to reverse the trauma symptoms in humans, which is what I talk about in the book. It sounds like we're all in the same boat and it's sinking, but it's not true. There are things that we can do.
Yeah, Mark, it does sound terrifying to think about, but I just wanted to say, I remember that part about the mice, I was reading it, and this it's great. Like the gene makeup is, like you said, 93% the same, and that's stressing them out like that. It just affects the grandchildren. Like that's even if they weren't directly affected by it, like that just goes to show how trauma can be passed on. I mean, the proof is in the pudding, pretty much. But I wanted to ask you, Mark, I want to ask you, how could someone tell if he or she might be suffering from an inherited trauma? Like, what are the signs of that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking that question, because it's a good question, and it's one of these things that the listener probably right now to your show is probably asking, well, how do I know if I'm carrying this stuff? So, yes, we can be born with a fear or an anxiety or a depression and never separate it from ourselves, which is how I was born this way. But sometimes we can experience a fear or an anxiety or a symptom that strikes as soon as we hit a certain age or hit a certain milestone in our life. And it's as though there's this ancestral alarm clock that starts ringing inside us. For example, we all of a sudden become 30 years old, and we look at our partner and we start to split up from our partner without ever thinking that 30 was the same age that our parents broke up, or 30 was the same age our grandma or grandpa became widowed, and we don't make the connection. It's or we hit this event in our life. It isn't just ages. For example, as soon as we get married, and all of a sudden we get married and we feel depressed, or we get married and we feel trapped. In the book, I talk about this woman. She loved her husband, but felt trapped as soon as she got married And when we look back at her family history, um, her family was Iraqi, and both of her grandmothers had been given away as child brides, one at 9 and one at 12, to much older men. So as soon as she gets married, she loves her husband. He's the right guy for her. But the feeling in her is this feeling of being trapped. And now she gets where it comes from just by looking back in the family history. You know, it expresses differently in both of her sisters. The one sister marries a much older man, like her grandmother's, and the other sister never wanted to get married at all. And, you know, so that's one trigger, getting married. Another trigger is we move to a new place. And suddenly we become depressed like our ancestors that were persecuted, forced out of their homeland, sold into slavery. And the trigger for us is moving to a new place. It's funny, right? We move to a new city, yet what lives in us is this new place is where we're defeated, is where everything starts to go south. Or even we get rejected by our partner. And that's the trigger. And all of a sudden we have this grief and it's insurmountable. But we've only been with this partner 2 months. It doesn't make sense. But it takes us back to a much earlier grief, which is a break in the attachment with our mom. Or hey, here's this one. We go to have a child. And again, it's as though that ancestral alarm clock starts ringing, and we get postpartum depression, or we have depression during the pregnancy. I remember I worked with this woman one time, and she was consumed with anxiety, and all she knew when she came to the office is she had anxiety. But as soon as we broke it down, I said, when did this anxiety start? And she said, 7 months ago. What happened 7 months ago? Well, that's when I became pregnant. And, you know, I knew she was pregnant. And so I said, what's the worst thing that could happen about you having a baby? And immediately she said, oh my God, I could harm my baby. I could harm my baby. And I asked her if she had ever harmed a baby, and she said no. And then I went to ask her I asked her if anyone in her family had harmed a baby, and she was just about to say no. And then she said, oh, my grandmother. When she was a young woman, she lit a candle and she caught the curtains on fire, and it caught the house on fire. And she couldn't get her baby out, and the baby died. And then she said, but we were never allowed to talk about it. And in that moment, we both made pretty big connections. She made the link that she had inherited the terror from her grandmother, that she was living her grandmother's terror in her body. And then we could break the pattern. But what it showed me again and again and again is that we have this trauma language that isn't always ours. And whenever the parents don't let us talk about something, or the grandparents say, we don't go there, this feeds the stream. In other words, the more we stay silent, the more we shut up, the more we hold back, the more we keep the past tightly sealed. You know, the events we don't talk about because you don't want to hurt your grandmom. You don't want to hurt your mom. Never bring that up because mom gets hurt when you talk about how her marriage fell apart. Grandma gets hurt when you talk about how that baby died. That feeds the pattern. The more we have to ignore the past, the more it can come back and haunt us. But the more we can explore the past, the more we don't have to repeat it. We can break these patterns.
Mark, I just want to say it's amazing to sit here and listen to you. You know, just pretty much it feels like I'm getting the book reread to me, and it's amazing. it's really amazing. You know, just to hear you talk about it, and just I feel like I'm learning. It's like I'm learning so much. You know, it's incredible. So you brought up core language and trauma language. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like, what's the difference? What's trauma language? What's core language?
Well, remember that woman. So she all I know, she comes to me and says, I have this anxiety. And when we break it down, she says, I'll harm my baby. So one of the ways, as you know from reading the book 2 times, is that question I ask people, one of the questions, which I call the core sentence, which is, what's your worst fear? What's the worst thing that could happen to you? If things went terribly wrong, if things suddenly fell apart, what's your worst fear? What's that worst thing that could happen to you? And then when people give that answer, that's one of the clues of this trauma language. And I've discovered that when a trauma happens, there are these clues that get left behind in our body. We have these emotionally charged words and sentences that they form a breadcrumb trail, Alec. When I teach people how to be a detective in the book, how to follow it, how to follow that language back to the family history. Because once we know how to uncover this trauma language, this unconscious language, we can link it to the original traumas. And it's like finding that missing piece of the puzzle that lets the whole picture come into view and finally gives us a context that finally explains why we feel crappy, why we feel the way we do. And then there's another piece of trauma language too. We know from trauma theory, and I also talk about this in that book, that when a traumatic event happens, significant information kind of, it's like an explosion in our brain. Some of this information bypasses the frontal lobes. So the experience of exactly what happened to us in the trauma can't be named or ordered through words or language because the language centers get compromised. So we either remember too much or remember too little. And then without language to sort of explain our experiences, to sort of give us a context for healing what happens to us, our experiences instead get stored as fragments of memory, fragments of language, fragments of body sensations, fragments of images, fragments of emotions, because it's like the mind, it disperses and everything gets separated. We lose the story, but what lives in our body now are the emotions and sensations, but we never complete the healing because the mind's now disorganized. And it can stay disorganized like this. It can stay lost for generations. But what I've learned is these pieces aren't lost. They've simply been submerged. They've simply been rerouted. And then the job of the book or the job of the therapist is to gather this language, gather the pieces of the puzzle, gather these emotions, gather the story fragments, gather the sensations in our body, and link it together, connect the dots, so we can bring together what's been lost or separated, so we can separate out what doesn't belong to us, these behaviors or these feelings that aren't ours, or we can integrate what needs to be integrated, the parts of us that got fragmented. So trauma language, like I talk about in the book, is either verbal, words like I'll lose my baby, I'll do something terrible, I'll harm a child, I'll lose my family, I'll go to jail, I'll be all alone, I'll get rejected, I'll be abandoned. My language from the book I talked about was I'll be ruined, I'll be annihilated, I won't exist, I won't matter. Sentences like that is trauma language. And when we can uncover this trauma language, that's the verbal trauma language. But there's also, and I mentioned it earlier when we talked about the signs, what is nonverbal trauma language? Well, those are those signs. The physical and emotional symptoms that show up after an unsettling event, or the fears and the anxieties that strike suddenly when we reach a certain age. And often it's the same age something terrible happened in the family history. Or, I tell people when we're looking at our depressions and our destructive behaviors, when did, and there's those questions in the book, when did it arrive? What happened? Before you started doing this destructive thing, this destructive behavior, what was going on exactly before it started? What situation were you in? How old were you? All those questions that I have, because it often points to something similar, a similar trauma in the family history. And then nonverbal trauma language, hey, it's also in our relationship struggles. It's in the repeated ways we deal with money, with success. All of this, Alex, it forms a breadcrumb trail that I always think we need to follow. We got to follow it.
Yeah, that's again, man. I mean, it's putting pieces together, and yeah, just you taught me something else just now. Figuring out what happened before someone started having these thoughts and just having these feelings. What was going on at that time, right before that? That's huge.
Exactly. There's a chapter in my book, I think it's called The Core Complaint. I have 12 questions, 10 or 12 questions at the end of that chapter that, that's the Bible. That's the other Bible right there, to ask those questions when we're starting to have a, like some big upset, or some behavior, our drinking is starting to come out, or our drug use is starting to rise. It's really important to break it down and to see what triggers it. What are some of the events or feelings or sensations in our body that trigger, that are the triggers, because that's how we learn to gather this trauma language, this verbal trauma language, this nonverbal trauma language. Ned, I feel like I should share some cases with you. Um, hmm.
We have time if you
Yeah,
want to share a couple of cases with me, man.
let me share a case. I think that's a good idea, actually. Let me share a case with you, because I'll share a case that's I'll share one of them that's not in the book. When I was when I'm trying to decide which one to tell. Yeah, I think I'll tell this one. When I was a young therapist and I was working with cutters, I was always working with heavy stuff. And I remember I was working a lot with self-injury and self-injurers. Now, self-injury can be anything. It doesn't have to be cutting or burning ourselves with a cigarette. I mean, it can be high-risk behaviors. It can be drugs. It can be drinking. But I was working with a lot of self-injurers. And this one particular woman, she was 24 years old. She would cut herself in such an extreme way that it didn't make any sense. Like, she would almost bleed to death, Alec. And her mother and her father would have to rush her to the hospital. And she would cut into her arms and her legs and her abdomen so deeply, man. She'd hit a vessel, a vein, an artery, and she'd almost die. She'd almost bleed to death. And that's one of the signs. Here, I'm going to call it, that's her nonverbal trauma language, hers. Why is she cutting in this extreme way and almost bleeding to death? So she came into my office, and I said to her, Sarah, I'm going to call her Sarah. That's not her real name. Sarah, I'm going to give you this pen, and you put it to your arm like you're going to cut, and tell me what is that feeling in that moment when you have. And I started to see the color drain out of her face when she had the pen against her arm. And I said, right there, what's that feeling right there? And she looked at me and said, I don't deserve to live. And Alec, here I am. I'm looking at a 24-year-old woman whose life has just begun. And I said, what did you do? Did you take someone's life? She said, no, nothing like that. But here's the verbal part of her trauma language. I don't deserve to live. Now I started to ask about her mom and her dad, and they were loving. And I started to ask about, could she receive her mother's love and her father's love? Yeah, she could. Was she a giver to them instead of a receiver? No, she was able to receive. Because one of the ways to break that down, sometimes we give to our parents because we can't receive, because we have a break in the bond. But no, she was able to receive. So I looked at the attachment with her mom. It was safe. It was secure. It was strong. And I was lost. This was about 25 years ago. I was lost, Alec. I didn't know where to go. And thank goodness I asked this question. I said, well, tell me about your grandparents. And boom, she dropped the bomb. Her grandmother was an alcoholic, and she was driving the car drunk. And grandpa was sitting in the passenger seat, and she crashed into a telephone pole. And she lived. But grandpa went through the window and got cut on the glass, on the windshield, and bled to death before the ambulance arrived. And right there, right in that moment, The whole story was true. When she cut herself and she almost bled to death and had to be rushed to the hospital, something in her was telling the story about her grandfather who bled to death before he could get to the hospital. And then when she had the feelings, I don't deserve to live, well, they weren't her feelings. That was her grandmother's feeling taking a life, and the life of her beloved even. And then that was the second clue that connected her to the feeling of her grandmother. And then I knew just what to do with her. I put 2 chairs out in the middle of the room, and I said, tell your grandfather that you cut yourself. She never met him, right? Because her dad was 12 when this happened. And I said, tell your grandpa that you never met what you do, that you cut yourself so deeply that you almost bleed to death, and add the words, the way you bled to death, Grandpa. And she was crying, and she said her grandfather was there in the spirit world supporting her, telling her not to do that, that he'll protect her. And then I had her look at the other chair and close her eyes and tell her grandmother, hey, Grandma, and I feel like I deserve to die, and I see that it isn't me. That was how you would have felt. She never met her grandma because her grandma died when her dad was 20. So she never met her grandma, and here she is talking to them. And I said, so what are you being shown? And she said, well, my grandma and my grandpa, they're behind me, supporting me, and telling me that every time I have the feeling to cut myself, to feel them loving me, supporting me, holding me, and give that feeling to them. And she did that. She breathed out that feeling to them. And instead she felt their support, and she never cut again.
That's that's man, that's truly powerful. That's a powerful breakthrough right there. Um, but it's just, again, it goes to show, like you were saying in the book, man, how everything's connected, and it's like an epiphany when you ask her that question and she hits you with, those my grandparents, and I just, wow. Thank you for sharing that, Mark. Thank you. You didn't have to share that specific detail, but I greatly appreciate it.
You're so welcome. I think the case is poignant. For people who haven't read the book, I think, just hearing a case like that. Now, not everybody struggles that deeply. Most people are struggling with anxiety and depression and relationships that don't work, and issues with addiction. And really, we've got to look at what happened in our family history, specifically over the last 3 generations. And we've got to look at, our early relationship with our mom. And we've got to look at how, one of the things I want to make sure I get to talk about here is how we heal, Alec, because, I think that people need to know, first of all, we are either carrying our grandmother, grandfather's, mother, or father's experience, and it's unconscious to us. We're going to jail like our father. We're drinking like our dad, failing like our dad, giving a child away like our mom, depressed like our mom. We have poor health like our mom. It could be mom, dad, mom, dad. I'm just throwing that out. It doesn't always go to one side or the other. Having broken relationships like our parents. We need to look at how we're doing something similar, or how our life mirrors the life of our grandmother or our grandpa, even if we never met them. And then how we heal. We've got to have a new experience that can change our brain. We've got to have an experience that we believe in, that's meaningful to us. An experience powerful enough to override that stress response that we've either inherited, or, it happened when we were a baby, or when we were little, or when we were a child. And then we need to practice the new feelings and the sensations associated with this experience. It can be like Sarah, in that case, that's not a real name, but it can be like she had feelings of receiving comfort and support from her grandparents. or we could practice feelings of compassion or feelings of gratitude. Every day Oprah told us how to have a gratitude practice. And, the reason why is the state of gratitude, the feeling state, feeds the prefrontal cortex. And, that's where we need to have an experience that gets us out of our midbrain, out of our amygdala, out of our stress response. And we need to bring more engagement to the other parts of our brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, where we can integrate these experiences and we can heal. And by doing so, not only do we create new neural pathways in our brain, which we do, we also stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, or feel-good hormones like estrogen, oxytocin, and even the way the genes are involved in the body's stress response. They can begin to function in a different way. And these are experiences of comfort, support, generosity, gratitude, compassion, loving kindness, practicing mindfulness, ultimately anything that allows us to feel strength and peace inside, because these experiences feed the prefrontal cortex and they can help us reframe the stress response so it has a chance to calm down.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for sharing that. That was going to be my next question, actually. So
yeah.
I'm
Hey,
glad you. I'm glad you took care of that. Before I want to end our interview, man, I want to ask you, can you give some tips on how to break the cycle of inherited family trauma, like how to stop it from going any further?
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to do that. First, if we are suffering or our kids suffering, maybe we're struggling with unexplained depression or unexplained anxiety or a phobia or obsessive compulsive thoughts, we really do need to shake the family tree. I don't mean to sound funny, but we really do. We need to shake that tree and see what falls out. What family secrets have been hidden? What stories didn't get told? What traumas never healed all the way? And then it's important to know these things, especially if we or our kids are struggling with symptoms, because, we don't want to repeat it. We want to break the patterns. So we've got to talk about, these traumas in our family history, and we got to try to work through them ourselves so they're not passed down to future generations, because the more we know about what happened, the more we can talk about them, and then the more we're able to bring relief to our kids that may not even have a clue as to why they're suffering. And then, as I said a minute ago, we've got to have a new experience that can change our brain, experience that we trust, that we feel connected to, that we feel is relevant or meaningful. And then we got to practice the new feelings and sensations of that experience, of whether it's gratitude or what do I feel when I'm having a practice of loving kindness, or what do I feel when I'm feeling compassion for myself or compassion for what my parents went through. And then practice. Anything that allows us to feel strength and peace inside. That is important, because that's how we heal.
I want to thank you, Mark, again for taking time out of your busy schedule and life to sit down and have this interview with me. I've been looking forward to it for quite some time, actually.
Me too. Good.
It was funny when I first started the podcast, man, over a year ago. Your name was one of the people I wanted to reach out to be a guest on here, to have this interview with me. And I didn't, I waited a little bit. I wanted to build up the portfolio a little bit of it, get a little bit more established, and it was well worth the wait, man. I really do appreciate you coming on.
Good. Thank you. I'm glad to be on. I really think that our questions and answers and our talk together, I think maybe we raised a little bit of awareness, and And that's a good thing, man. Thank you for having me.
As long as at least one person's life is positively affected, then good work was done. That's how I
Beautiful.
feel.
Well put, Alec. Well put.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on, Mark, and I hope you have a good day. Um, I just, again, man, I'm really grateful that you came on to the Let's Talk It Out podcast.
Thank you for having me, Alec. You have a good day too.